All right, so the magic is working. It took a second, but we did the trick. Thank you to Nino, Massimiliano, and Andrea. I'll be able to speak Italian and listen to you in Italian. You'll be able to speak your own language, so doing that in English. So first thing first, I'd like to thank you for being here with us today. Really happy that you're here, and we really admire your work. Together, we've read 2 of your books, The Lost Language of Cranes, as well as Equal Affections.
Abbiamo letto anche individualmente tanti altri libri. Io, ad esempio,
We've also individually read other books. I read Family Dancing. Some of us have read Shelter in Place. And so when we decided to ask you to come here, we didn't really believe that an author as important as you are would be down to meet a book club as small as ours. But when you told us yes, we really were happy. And so I think we can just go with it, go with everything, actually. I think we could actually try and get in touch with Virginia Woolf and do like a seance with her, because we really do have interpreters on our side. And so this book club was founded in 2017. We've read around 60 books, had around 60 meetings, during where we usually do like a literary quiz, read poetry and eat. And we also do lots of meetings. We go to the theater together, to the cinema, and we also meet writers such as we were doing with you. Tonight, we're going to follow this program. Nicola will be doing a brief introduction, and then we'll just get started with the questions, the one you have read already. I'll give the word to Teresa now.
You're faint.
Okay, so you still need me to interpret. So now can you hear me?
Nel canale italiano, ok.
Adesso dovrebbe sentirti. Ok.
Mi senti adesso? Proposto e per me volevo dire a tutti che un po' insomma il rapporto con David spero di poter dire amici da tanti anni, e per me è stata una cosa molto importante, perché una delle poche volte in cui da vera fan, proprio da vera grande appassionata dei suoi libri, ho avuto l'occasione abbastanza casuale di conoscerlo e poi di diventare nell'ordine prima sua amica e poi anche suo editore. Questa è una cosa, insomma, chiaramente che ha anche un po' cambiato la nostra vita, sia la nostra vita personale che la vita della casa editrice. Quindi siamo veramente molto molto orgogliosi. È un po' il nostro fiore all'occhiello, è una persona molto vicina al nostro cuore, come sapete. E niente, quindi io sono contentissima di essere qua, di accompagnarvi in questa cosa, e vi lascio la parola e cercate di tirar fuori da questo signore il meglio, perché ha tante cose da dire.
So Nicola will just introduce the book now. Okay, thank you. Hi, David. Nice to see you or meet you. I'm really happy that we're here today. I've been reading your books ever since the 90s, or the end of the 90s, and I've read possibly every single one of your books. I'm not really sure which one is my favorite, but Equal Affections that we're dealing with tonight, I'm really fond of. I think it's the first of your books that I've read. Then I read Family Dancing and The Lost Language of Cranes, but this was the very first one. And at the time, 30 years ago, I was 18 or 19, and that was one of the first books with gay characters or homosexual characters. And that was really formative for me at the time, because one of the pros of this book, it's that it goes through a story that is not centered around homosexuality, but that has gay characters such as April, Danny, or Walter. And it represents relations which are normal. The word or adjective normal, I'm not really fond of it nowadays, and I sort of critique it. The risk of normalization, let's say that. But when I was 18, for me, it was really important and again formative to read something such as what you've read. Not a perfect relation, but a real one. The very few items of LGBT literature that I had read at the time was literature talking about homophobia, derogation, discrimination, or a coming of age, such as coming out and problems related. So reading this very book was a sort of a newfound happiness. And it's something I really gathered ex post, the grandeur of your book, especially at the time. And I think this book is one of the first ones that have done this. And in a sort of way, it goes down a path that allowed for a change, in which we are already able to see in one of the pages in The Lost Language of Cranes, which dealing with the epidemics of HIV and AIDS, some of the characters reflect upon how this pandemic, essentially, or epidemic, had people drawing back or retiring from the public life compared to what the life we had in the 60s or in the 70s, where we really were politic or experimenting with relations and sexuality. And so The Lost Language of Cranes in some way takes this into account, reflects upon it, and this very book, Equal Affections, shows a new era, like a private story of a family and the conflicts of their relations. And just as in each of your novels, and it makes part of your style, the very first ones that you wrote, the ability that you have of construing and building up the character, its interiority, it really comes through your very sentences without being pretentious, as in you allow the reader to get that. And so the characters are really complex. They have multifaceted emotions, love, conflictuality, emotions, and they are similar but never equal. And at times, the similarity, which is not equalness, allows them to, or hinders them from connecting, such the father. They are, again, characters similar but not equal. They sort of try to get away. And the very style of Louise or the mother or Walter, Daniel's partner, they try to just live their life. They appreciate it, but they're trying to get away with it, from it, I'm sorry. And so the complexity of real characters is the very reason why reading this book today, after 30 years, your book comes off as actual, present. It talks about something universal that we all know. It's not something bound to a certain period of time. It talks about psychology, the complexity of relationships, and the whole group liked it. So I'm not going to take any more time from the questions, and I'll leave the floor to the guys. So thank you. If there are no further questions, I'll just start. So I'd like to do this very first question, which is actually not as happy, deals with death. And when I read it, the book, it looked like the idea of death and illness, it played like a key role in dealing with some of the themes that then came out when reading. At the beginning, we talk about illness personified, as well as a death, which is personified as an aunt that lingers around the house. And so is this personification of the death making death itself a sort of fifth main character, do you think? And I was also wondering whether the role that death plays in this book, and again, also if the narrative arc is trying or aiming at analyzing also when this fifth character just fades.
Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here with you, if only virtually. I wish I were there in person. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Okay. And I'm sorry not to be speaking Italian. Whenever I'm in Italy, my Italian returns, but when I'm in the States, my Italian tends to disappear or become very inept. So thank you for your patience. Let me just start off by saying I have a bad memory for my own books, and this book in particular, I have a really bad memory of, because I haven't actually looked at it probably in about 25 years. It's a curious book. It's probably my own least favorite of my books, which doesn't mean anything because authors are terrible judges of their own work. But it's sort of the least favorite child, and I think for that reason I've tended to stay away from it. And why is it the least favorite child? Oh, Mark, my husband, just stuck his head in to say it's one of his favorites. He disagrees with me on this, and he's a better judge than I am. But I think that part of the reason that I tend to judge that book a little more harshly than my others is that it's a very personal book to me, and it really grew out of my mother's death. If death is a character in the book, it's because at that moment in my life, my mother had just died. So I'd just been through this experience, which I wrote about fairly, the death of Louise, the death of the mother, is really a not particularly well disguised version of my own mother's death. So that was very much on my mind. And the fact that that was happening simultaneously with the early phase of the AIDS epidemic or pandemic meant that I was probably more preoccupied with death than most people that as young as I was 25 years old when I wrote this book. That's not usually an age when you're preoccupied with death, but maybe it is if it's the middle of the AIDS epidemic and you've just gone through the loss of your own mother. So yes, I think death is very much a presence in this book and probably in all my books that are sort of death haunted, some more than others, but it may be a reflection of my own preoccupations. It may be simply a reflection of my own experience or of the times I've lived in. Yeah.
Thank you, David. And also, it really moved me, the way in which Louise died. The gesture she makes just before she dies, where she draws a heart for her children. It is really something that moved every single one of us. And one of the first Italian editions has a piece of paper in the first page with a heart drawn on it, and it really moves us. I
That was
agree,
the
death
original
is really
cover.
an ever-present over the book. And so the characters are sort of ambivalent. And this makes them really, really human and believable, we could say. The relationship between siblings or partners and lovers, again, is ambivalent. And I think our very personal relationships are. For example, April Danny or Eleanor Louise. Eleanor, Louise's sister, at times plays off as hypocrite or hypocritical and brutal towards Louise, where she sends her horrible articles about the HIV pandemic. But at the very same time, she cares about her, and she's not just brutal then, but also affectionate. And the same goes for Louise. She doesn't really stand her, but she's not really able to take a stand. And also lovers. We have Walter on the one hand, who wants to flee from Danny, find himself a new job, but at the very same time, he decides to stick with him. And that goes with for Louise as well. She wants to flee, but and also when she dies, she thinks about her youth lover, we could say that, but she still sticks with a partner. And so my direct question is, do you think the ambivalence lies at the very heart of being human, as in we are inconsistent and ambivalence? And do you think neurosis and the unhappiness of the characters stem from our very resistance to our own nature, which is ambivalent and inconsistent?
Yes, I think everything you said is true. Seems to me a very astute reading of the novel. As I said, I was very, very young when I wrote this book, and I wasn't as self-conscious maybe as I am now. And so I wasn't really thinking a lot about the ideas inherent in the book. I was really telling a story that was partially invented and partially based on my own experience. The heart, that was true, that my mother did draw a heart just before she died for me. And that was the original cover of the book, was that heart. So a lot of this material was simply a young, impressionable writer trying to translate his own experience into fiction. Another part of the novel that was very autobiographical was and probably one of the strangest to readers at that time was the section about sort of internet, an early version of what we would now call sexting, the whole online, these sort of online, slightly pornographic flirtations that Walter engages in. And that was, of course, at that point, a very new phenomenon and technologically very primitive compared to what we have now. And I remember at the time, people were really bewildered by this idea that men could go online and have dirty conversations and sort of get excited by them, and that these could actually turn into emotionally meaningful relationships that were conducted entirely online. Well, this is the world we live in now. That was a very preliminary stage. And again, I was writing totally out of my own experience. I had a friend who knew a lot, who was in technology, who said, yeah, there's this cool thing called CompuServe, and if you go to this particular chat room, it's all gay guys, looking for sex or looking for dirty talk. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I was discovering this long before it became a mainstream phenomenon. So all of that in the novel is pretty much autobiographical. The part that is completely invented is the character of April, who is sort of based on my sister, but my sister was not a folk singer, nor was my sister a lesbian. So maybe one of the reasons that I am less than perfectly satisfied with this novel is that I'm not sure in my own mind that for me, the invented parts and the true parts actually fit together. But as I said, I haven't read it in 25 years, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask.
Thank you. And one of the other topics is the idea of loneliness. At times, it looks like characters just remain or end up alone. How do you see that? What's your point of view on this?
Well, it's funny. I think that's, in retrospect, it surprises me that I was writing about these things when I was 25, because these are much more the preoccupations that I have now in my life. As you get older, you think about loneliness and death more and more and more. I think it was, again, a reflection of the times in which I was growing up that I was preoccupied with these things then. But yeah, I think people are constantly looking for solutions to loneliness, but I think there's also, and this may be reflected in the novel, but it's certainly how I feel now, there's a great fear of intimacy. So this is why, again, to bring up the internet and social media, the internet provides a means of being alone, of not being alone, but not actually being with other people. It's a sort of a pseudo intimacy that I think for a lot of people has actually replaced the real intimacy of spending time with each other, and even sexuality sex is something that people conduct increasingly through machines. So oddly enough, I feel like these media that have been invented to bring people together, that are, look at the term social media with the emphasis on the word social, are actually kind of antisocial. Although, what would we have done during the pandemic if we had not been able to communicate via Zoom? So I'm ambivalent about that as well. But yeah, loneliness is something I think about a lot, and solitude. I am not a terribly social person. I am someone who tends to stay home a lot. I would say I'm reclusive. What is that? Is that the legacy of my family? I think probably, to some degree. Is it a reflection of the times that I live in, which are difficult and traumatic? That's part of it too. So I always see my job as a writer being not so much to try to answer these questions as simply to ask them, to put them out there for other people to think about, and maybe to dramatize them through fiction.
Thank you. I'd like to focus on more than just characters, and it sort of looked like you've described frustrated characters, as in they try to do or be something which they are hindered from the outside from being, as in they cannot be who they really want to be. And so my very question is, do you reckon there are external forces conspiring against us in some way, which really actually hinder us from becoming fully fledged? And another thing that we have analyzed is that the characters you have described, we sort of see each other in themselves and we're empathetic towards them. This might lead us to another question, that is to say, the very feelings we have towards these characters, should we not be giving that to other human beings?
A friend of mine, whom I respect a lot, was talking to me just last week about my early novels, and she said that what she thought made them successful was that I allowed the reader to make friends, as she put it, with some very scary and dark material. That is to say, things that at that time were particularly frightening, such as the mere fact of coming out as a gay person, which in the 1980s was it's always a frightening prospect, but it was particularly so then in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. The idea of outside forces that frustrate our ability to be ourselves, absolutely. I mean, I think we do it to ourselves sometimes as well. We, to use a kind of trendy academic term, we internalize those outside forces, and therefore we become our own victims. But there are still outside forces, and I think I'm sorry to say that right now, these oppressive forces are getting to be very strong again. We're living at a moment where politically, there is a surge in power on the part of people who essentially want to deny other people the right to live the way they want to live. I mean, fascists, right-wing people, Republicans, this is what it's all about. It's saying there is a right way to live and a wrong way to live, and we want to return to a period when those who lived in what we consider the wrong way were punished. Well, that was the 1950s. The 1950s in the United States, the age of McCarthyism, the age of some of the worst homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism that the world has ever known, certainly that the United States has ever known. So I think that feeling of being at the mercy of outside forces is stronger than ever. And it's actually quite debilitating. And I think for a lot of people, including myself, this moment in history is probably the most difficult that we've ever known, and the most frightening, because there is this sense of our personal liberty that we have fought very hard to have being threatened. And Teresa's heard me talk about this endlessly. I feel this particularly living in Florida, because Florida is a state with a really odious, malevolent Republican governor who may very well be our next president, and who I am genuinely afraid of. And of course, in Italy, you are in a similar situation right now with a fascist prime minister. So yeah, and I think the writer's job is to call attention to the way that these forces affect us, but also to focus on the personal side of experience, not on the political side. I mean, to talk about politics through the lens of how people's daily lives are affected. And sometimes those effects are very, very subtle, but they're still pernicious, even if they're subtle.
Thank you. My question would still focus on the characters, and especially the role that Danny plays. He sounds really important because the book opens up with his very character, and so his perspective, his point of view, which is often really comprehensive and never judgmental. But he remains nonetheless the very character we sort of cannot really understand or sum up. We can't really pigeonhole him in a particular category. And so what is Danny? What role does he play? Is he the really binding force of the network of relationships within the novel, or is there someone else who does or plays this role better?
Well, to answer that question very simply, he's me. He's a stand-in for me. And I think that's another reason that this is something that I did more in my early fiction than later, is that I would have these characters who, even if they didn't have the same lives that I did, effectively I was with these figures, with Philip in The Lost Language of Cranes, with Danny in Equal Affections. Those were my eyes, and that was my mind. I put myself in that situation, but really I think if he's an ambivalent character, it's probably because he is, at least in part, an authorial figure, a stand-in for the author. This was something that later in my career I tried to get away from doing, from having these characters who were obviously versions of myself. And because I think the problem with characters like that is that exactly what you've said, it's very, very difficult to identify their role in the story, because they don't really belong in the story. They're stand-ins for the author.
All right. Good evening, David. Again, talking about characters, I wanted to ask you, when we dealt with the topic of love, we as a group, we dealt with love and loving. Some of us thought that the character most able to love was Daniel, and other reckon it's Louise. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see this? Who's the character better able to love or give love to someone? And also, are all affections equal or not?
So as I said earlier, and this is a point that I always make when I teach, I think the writer's job is to ask questions, not answer them. And you have isolated exactly the questions that the novel poses. And I think I don't know the answers to them even now, even so many years after I wrote it, I still don't know. All these characters are trying to love with varying degrees of success, and how they do it depends a lot on their own histories. I mean, Louise grew up in a very different time. She's a mother. Danny's her son. The love for a son for his mother and the love of a mother for her son are very different kinds of love. Regarding that epigraph, Auden is one of my very favorite poets, and I think that it's such a beautiful line. And what I was trying to get at with the title and with that epigraph was the question of whether it's better to be the object of love or to be the person who is in love. I mean, if you consider a case of unreturned love, or you have a crush on someone and that person doesn't, which is in a sense, from a moral or emotional standpoint, the better role to play. I think I would always rather be, and I side with Auden in this, the more loving one, rather than the object of love who doesn't necessarily feel as much love. Now that's a kind of a particular situation that I think Auden was writing about. I'm almost sure he must have been referencing his relationship with Chester Kallman. And likewise, I think it like any good epigraph, it sort of it kind of floats over the surface of the novel, and you can look at it different ways depending on which section of the novel or which characters you're talking about. But I appreciate your question, because that is exactly the question I want readers to have, but I don't know the answer.
Okay, can you hear me? I'll just read it because I'm somehow emotional. I really liked the idea of talking about homosexuality not as something isolated, but as something which was connected to histories and families. I thought about equal affections in this sense, as well as While England Sleeps, which it really talks about the Nazi era, as well as love being intertwined with a relevant historical era. And I was interested in knowing the idea of dealing and talking about love in this very sense. Is it you trying to get over the very category of how love should be talked to in literature? And also, did you try to use homosexuality within the fiction as something that we need to know, but as something which interplays with the very context it is growing with? So something that is intertwined with family and history and has the same dignity. I hope my question came through. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've given me a good opportunity to tell a story that is a sort of oblique way of answering your question. Have any of you read or are you familiar with a novel from the late 1970s called Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran? This is a kind of iconic novel of gay New York pre-AIDS, but just before the AIDS crisis. And it's considered, you know, a major work of LGBT American literature. When I first read this book, and I was probably 17 or 18, I hated it because it described a world that I didn't want to be a part of. It described a kind of a New York urban gay sex culture, bars and clubs that felt, and characters who were mostly alienated in this environment in a way that was very honest and that I found very troubling. I thought, that's not the life I want to have. And so I kind of just sort of rejected that book out of hand. I sort of pushed it aside. I didn't want to deal with it. I wanted but I also think I wrote my early books in response to it. I was trying to provide an alternative way of writing about gay male experience other than through the lens of some large city with a lot of venues, you know, a lot of bars and clubs and sex clubs and what else, what have you. Well, okay, so fast forward many years to 2022. So the author of that book, Andrew Holleran, is actually a pseudonym. After he wrote the book, his elderly parents were ill in Florida. So he moved to Florida to take care of them, and he never left. He's now 80 years old, and he lives 20 minutes from me. And I never met him until 2 weeks ago. And it was an astonishing experience. He is such a wise, brilliant man, and has written a number of terrific books subsequently, including his most recent book, The Kingdom of Sand, which is about being gay and 80 years old in North Central Florida, where I live. A book I highly recommend. We talked a lot. We talked about this very question. We talked about what he was doing when he wrote that first novel of his, what I was doing around the same time, and the fact that from very different places, we've literally come to the same place. I mean, there's a 20-year age difference, but we're living in this remote, weird part of Florida. How did that happen? And I have, I think, a newfound respect for the courage that it took for him to write a book that really told the truth about that culture, and it didn't romanticize it, and it neither romanticized it nor did it satirize it. It was simply an honest reflection of what it was like to be a young gay person in New York in the 1970s. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to write about families and family life, and to look at gay experience in that context. But I have to say, it felt like a circle had come to a close when he and I met again, and now we're friends. And that has made me very happy.
Thank you. Okay, so my question, or what I reflected over, deals with a central topic of the novel, which is, or that is present, which is faith and religion, especially in the latter section where Louise and Father Abernathy met, and although she was a Jew, she tries to convert to Catholicism. He tries to look for something in Catholicism or comforting for him. And so could you tell us about the meaning of the novel, in the novel, of religion, of faith, and what it means for people who at times remain lonely or alone with themselves? How can they go back in contact with their inner selves? In this sense, for example, the husband being in love with someone else and her being ill with cancer. And so Father Abernathy invites her to reflect and ponder over her conversion. And so what I'm asking you is, what role does faith or religion play within the novel, and why did you choose to talk or deal with that in such a way?
That's a very interesting question, and I appreciate it. Well, at the time, once again, autobiography, this was true. My mother did, toward the end of her life, have a brief, I would say, flirtation with the idea of converting to Catholicism. I didn't really understand it at the time because my family is completely 100% Eastern European Jewish, but we were raised without much consciousness of our ethnicity, and certainly with no religion. I was raised in a completely non-religious family. I didn't really understand. I knew I was Jewish, but I didn't really know what that meant. And so when my mother became fascinated with Catholicism and was considering converting, it was all mysterious to me because I didn't really think of my mother as a Jew. So I was thinking, well, what's she converting from? She's like me. She's sort of non-religious. In the years since I wrote that book, of course, I have become, well, maybe not coincidentally, fascinated by writers who were Catholic converts. And there are so many. I can think of off the top of my head, Graham Greene, perhaps most notably, Muriel Spark, a novelist I love, who was Jewish and converted to Catholicism. I've learned a lot more about Judaism and about Catholicism, and I see a lot of parallels between the two religions, and certainly the types of Jewish families and Catholic families have a lot in common. The question of faith is one that I have really only started to think about seriously maybe in the last 10 years. And that is in part because I was doing a lot of research for the books I've written set in the past, for example, about World War II and about the experience of the Jews in World War II. And that, of course, heightened my own awareness of myself as a Jew. And I started investigating more my own family history. I've also, though, have this weird fascination with Catholicism. Maybe it's not weird. Maybe it's just a fascination. Most of my favorite writers are Catholic. If I hear that a novel just talks about Catholic experience, I immediately want to read it. It's a curious thing. This fascination. It's a part of my love for Italy. It's even though I will not, the Catholic Church is extremely complicated and in many ways very malevolent organization. And in other ways, I mean, it's too simple to say that, but that there are ways in which the Catholic Church has done enormous harm. But at the same time, you can't love Italy without loving in some aspects of Catholicism, because there's so much part of Italian culture. I'll just conclude by saying that one of my colleagues here, and who's one of my closest friends, is a former Catholic priest. And since he left the priesthood, I've had a lot of conversations with him about his experience as a priest and why he left the priesthood. So this is a growing area of interest to me, and I'm sure one that will be reflected in whatever I write in the future.
Thank you. Again, thank you, David, for being here. It feels incredible to be to talk with you. You're an icon for me, and I'm sort of emotioned right now. And so I want to deal about places, the idea of places within the novel. It looks like places in the novel are more than backdrops to the events. They're symbols, and they embody fantasies and actions of the characters. And so, especially this book, for example, sees Danny having ideas and fantasies in New York, San Francisco, and it really hit me the very way you described New York and the Twin Towers, especially. And so the question has two sides. The first one being, do you find yourself in the sensation that the book is portraying, and so places interacting with the characters or the very peoples in the book? And the other side is the relationship that you have with the cities you talk about. And so New York, again, as it is ever present in your books, and you describe it with a certain emotional dimensionality. How do you see all this?
Thank you again for the question. It's a very interesting one. Well, I grew up in California, not far from San Francisco. And so in my childhood, I was very, very conscious of this dichotomy, West Coast, East Coast. My parents were Easterners who had migrated, as it were, west. So my entire extended family was on the East Coast, although they gradually began moving west more and more after my parents did. I guess you could say my parents were the pioneers. And California has historically always been associated with the idea of a new age, a new opportunity. Everything new happens in California. The East Coast, the further east you go, the older the world becomes. And so when I was growing up, I wanted the old world. I didn't feel I belonged in the new world. And the further east I could go, the older the world would get. So if I went to New York, that was a big step further east, a big step further back into a historically older world. Europe, even more so. You keep going, where do you end up? If you follow a certain path, you'll end up in India, which is maybe the oldest world of all on this particular trajectory. Well, I ended up in India. So this was very much how I regarded the world when I was a young person. Was as I've gotten older, of course, my relationships with these places have become more complex. California, my sister still lives there, but I don't go back very much. And San Francisco is a city I'm actually reluctant to return to because it's changed so much. It's no longer the city where I grew up, and to see what it has become, how ridiculously expensive, how it's been completely taken over by tech people, is very dispiriting, very depressing. New York, I thought when I was young that I would live my entire life in New York. I didn't. I ended up going to Europe, and then from Europe to Florida. And now I look at New York as a business place. New York is where I go when I have to, for work, for like when I need to do something involving my career as a writer, see my agent or my publisher. That's New York. My whole frame of reference has shifted. And for me, at this point, the cities that matter the most to me, the cities that I think of as my cities are Milan and Paris, and to some extent London, and to some extent Bombay. So and San Francisco and New York, I keep returning to as a writer. I keep setting things in New York, I guess, because I lived there for so long. I still have a lot of experience from my New York years to process. But these are not places that I feel drawn to anymore the way that I used to. If I could snap my fingers and go anywhere right now, I'd probably want to go this moment. I'd say, okay, Bombay. I'm in the mood. I really miss India, or maybe Milan, although I've been there more recently.
Cool, thank you. I wanted to go back to the idea of the gay lifestyle, which is dealt with in the novel, which is obviously set in Britain in the 80s. And so when Danny and the partner decide to go and live together, April writes a song which is living together, about living together. We can see the lyrics, and after we can read, we can see a very momentous sentence, which is at times, I think, the most political action that a gay or man or a gay woman is to live openly with another gay man or gay woman. That is to say, forming a partnership or being a couple. And so it was a really starting point in the 80s, although this really happened later in Italy. And so I was wondering how much, or actually, do you think this still applies together? Or is it still something which asks us for more integration, or has us ask for more integration in the society of it?
Well, I think the legalization of marriage equality, the legal right to marry whoever you want, no matter what that person's gender is, has made a huge, huge difference in every country in which it has been put into law. When I wrote this book, the idea that I could be married to another man was inconceivable. Even in the 80s, I didn't think it would ever happen. I didn't believe it. If you told me that at that time would come, I wouldn't have believed it. Well, now here I am. I am married to Mark. We've been together for 31 years. We've been married for 6 years. We live in a state where cannabis is legal. I mean, these were things that have been unimaginable in the 1980s. Now, that said, it's still, I think, in a lot of places in the world, a very, there is a certain risk and a certain courage that is required for two people just of the same gender to live together and be a couple, and the mere fact of their living together identifies them as a couple, and that forces people to acknowledge them who might not want to. So there is, yes, I think that is still a very political action. And as well, something that I talked about a lot when I was in Italy this summer was, the process of coming out never stops. You have to keep coming out your entire life. And one of the ways in which you sometimes have to come out is when you move and you have new neighbors, or when we have brand new neighbors, right? A young couple with 2 children. When I first met them, because they were young, I wasn't particularly worried about it. And I came up and I said, "This is Mark, my husband. We're so glad to welcome you to the neighborhood." That was great. It's been completely easy. But I could imagine a situation where we had neighbors who would be very, very uncomfortable with that. Well, what am I saying? They would be uncomfortable. I would be uncomfortable if I had, really homophobic neighbors. I would try to get them to move. So I think generally, if you live in a progressive city the way that I do, it's a pretty comfortable thing to be a same-sex couple. But that's not true everywhere. And I think it does require courage, and it is a political act. Because it's essentially saying, I'm not going to hide this. And there is risk associated with that. I mean, look at what just happened in Colorado Springs. There's still, gay people are at risk. There's no question about it. And the more open you are about it, the more at risk you put yourself. But that's a very, very important thing to do. It's where courage really shows, is in your willingness to be to sort of say to other people, this isn't my problem. If you are uncomfortable around me, that's your problem. It's not my problem. I'm just living my life. And I'm glad to say that I'm personally not in a position where I have to say that about anyone I know. But if I did, that would be the stance that I would take.
Good evening, and thank you for the time you're giving us. My question was about the very presence of chats in the book, which you've mentioned already. And so I was really curious about it, because it's something which to date or today is ever present, but at the time it sounded a bit futuristic, we could say. And what I noticed is that some characters in the book have virtual relationships, as in they don't see each other, they don't talk to each other physically, and they think that relation being complete. And others who appear to have a solid and physical, almost complete traditionally relationship, who try and look for a virtual escapade, we could say. And so from a standpoint which tries not to be judgmental, this looks really sort of tender. And do you still see it, or do you see it in this way? Are these 2 different types of equal affections, as in people trying to look for affection, people yearning for affection or love?
Thank you. Another very interesting question. Well, I'm not usually someone who is ahead of the curve or ahead of the trend, but when it came to sort of virtual sex, I was in at the beginning, when it was really a new thing, and when the only people you would find in these chat rooms would be computer geeks, because they were the only ones who knew how to get online, which was a very complicated business. And modems were very primitive, it was challenging. I learned all this from a friend. Subsequently, it's become so much just an ordinary part of our lives, not only virtual sex, but the internet as a means of meeting partners, dating. So many of my students, have met their partners or spouses online through Match.com or Tinder or Grindr. And that's becoming more and more the way that people meet. I think that it doesn't feel quite as transgressive as it used to, although there's all sorts of technological advancement. I mean, couples can now have sex through their computers using various devices that are attached to them, which I find I'm too old for that, but that does sort of amaze me. But on the other hand, it's become so commercialized. And I think the main problem with the internet as an arena for finding partners, either for life or just for a one night, is that it's so controlled by money. All these algorithms that are attempting to direct you toward what they think you want. This is so that people in Silicon Valley can get even richer. That's the only, and that is explicit. There's no way you can avoid seeing all the ads, for example. In the early days of the internet, there were no ads. There was no commercial aspect. This was purely a kind of experimental space for the very few people who knew about it in maybe the late 80s. And now it's become a shopping mall. And it's a shopping mall where you can buy, where among the things you can go shopping for are actual sex, virtual sex, husbands, wives, spouses, lawnmowers, Parmesan cheese, whatever. It's a shopping mall. And it's a shopping mall that's also constantly trying to get you to buy things that you aren't shopping for. So in that regard, it's changed a lot. And yet I don't think we can pretend that it isn't become the main way that people meet each other now. We used to go to bars. Now people go to Grindr or Tinder, whichever app they choose or prefer.
Good evening. And again, thank you. It is a real honor to be asking you this question. And again, I'm feeling sort of emotional as well. My question was about Louise, but also about the ending of the novel, which had us really talk about it in the first meeting. Throughout the novel, Louise's strength and her ability to fight off the disease is really talked about, especially after her very last entrance to the hospital, up until when her body just gives up. And so the book sort of end up with the ending of Louise's life, but at the very last pages of the books, we have a flashback to a week prior her entering the hospital, and we actually see that she has talked with a priest, which we have already talked about in another question, and that very moment is at the end of the book. So my question is, what is it that she understands in this moment? What is the turning point? And again, why have you decided, or did you decide, to end the book in this way?
Well, thank you for your question. The answer is that I don't know the answer. It's right now, as it happens, Mark and I his mother is very close to death. In fact, we're going up on Saturday to see her. Coincidentally, she's dying of the same disease that my father died of. And I think I was really, spending time with her reminded me of the time I spent with my mother when she was dying. And I think that there does come a moment when you sense that someone is starting to leave. We felt it on Thanksgiving with Mark's mother. We sensed that she was already starting the journey, I guess you could say. And this is a moment that I've talked to a lot of other people, a lot of my own experience that you often feel with people who are dying, that there comes a moment when they are already on their way. It may be a few weeks, a few months before they die, but the process has started. And I think that was really what I was trying to capture. And having never been in that situation, I think it's one of the few situations that even the most empathetic writer cannot really imagine what it feels like to be dying, to be on the verge of death. We watch it, and all we can do is honor it and try to take from it some sort of wisdom that will help us to deal with our own fears of death. Like most people, I'm very afraid of death, but the time that I have spent with people who are dying has curiously alleviated that fear, because I perceive that there often does come a point of acceptance. And I, trust and hope that that will be true for all of us. It's a funny thing. I had a student whose wife died of breast cancer when she was only 30. And she hated the analogy of fighting. She said, fighting cancer, battling cancer. It's the wrong analogy. You're not in a battle with cancer. You're trying to live with it. You're trying to figure out because you're not going to kill it. It's going to kill you. It's a losing battle. And so the battle analogy she hated. She said it's about almost learning to be married to it, learning to live with it, realizing that this is a permanent part of your life. And I thought that was a very interesting thing. People don't want to give up, but I'm not sure that to say we want to fight it is quite the right thing. You have to show courage, and you want to live as long as you can. But at a certain point, acceptance is something that's as important as resistance. And this is a lesson that I have learned over and over and over again, but I only know it from the outside. And all of us really only know it until the outside, until our time comes. God, I didn't mean to go on to quite such a morbid track there. So I'll stop.
So I'll just take we still have time. So I really liked The Lost Language of Cranes, as well as Equal Affections. So how much of that family is still there in Louise, Nat, Danny, and April's family?
Well, there are certainly elements of my family in both. I was so young when I wrote that book that I hadn't really, my whole life had been my family, basically. That was all that I knew. The family in Equal Affections resembles my family much more literally than the one in The Lost Language of Cranes, but both the mothers, Rose, there are certainly elements of my mother in Rose. Owen is so not my father. That's probably where The Lost Language of Cranes most diverges from my own life. He's a completely invented character. But Equal Affections, that's pretty much my family. Or, I mean, there are aspects of my family that I've left out of the book, but pretty much that family is my family.
And I'd just like to take up the floor for the last question about your style or writing style. Some of us have said that your style is minimalist or at times aseptic. And when we talked about your book, I disagreed, and some other of us disagreed. And I'd rather like to say your writing style is graceful, as Tondelli puts it. Again, your writing being graceful is your writing style. And so my very question is, do you agree with that? And how do you see your writing style as a writer?
Well, minimalist was a term that a lot of people were using in the 80s to describe, and they were using it rather a little bit the way the word autofiction is used now. Everybody who used it seemed to have a different definition. I, if you look at the word minimalism in its literal sense, if you look at minimalism as a phenomenon in the art world, and you're trying to find writers who you might say were doing the literary equivalent of artistic or architectural minimalism, yeah, there were some. There are a lot of them are writers I really admire. I never considered my style to be at all minimalist, and I think that title ended up being ascribed to me because I wrote short stories. Initially, I started with short stories. But no, I mean, I look at my work and I think, why did anyone ever say this was minimalist? Nothing I've written ever seems minimalist to me. But that's my own definition of minimalism. And every person you ask for a definition of minimalism is going to give you a different one. I think that, as I said, the same thing is happening now with the term autofiction, which, at least in the States, is something that my students use all the time. They'll say about a story, oh, this is autofiction. Well, if you actually look at the history of the word autofiction, which it comes from France and originated maybe 20 years ago, you see that it has an extremely narrow, specific meaning, and that really the only works of fiction that qualify as autofiction by that standard have to be French. So it's a word that it's like people are groping for something, for a word to describe some larger phenomenon. The phenomenon I think they were witnessing in the 80s, when Fernando Pivano, for example, was talking about minimalism, was fiction that was focused on domestic life, on family life, on the more mundane details of life, rather than fiction that was sort of, big and epic, or I mean, it's funny, Hemingway I always think of as a minimalist writer, but he rarely would get that label because there was such sense of adventure and being out in the world as opposed to being in the kitchen. Minimalism meant basically fiction where everyone was sitting around in the kitchen. Okay, that is what people meant, I think, when they said minimalist. Likewise, with autofiction, there's a tendency now, I think writers are tired of inventing, and they're tending to write work that derives much more explicitly from their own lives or from the real world. And so if you see a piece of fiction that sort of looks like it's also an autobiography, but it's also kind of a novel, and it's kind of a memoir, and it's kind of an essay, you have to think of a word for it. So you say autofiction. There is a real phenomenon going on where people are trying to break through the limits of these different categories. And autofiction is just a convenient word to describe it. Likewise, minimalism. My style is my style. I don't even know how to define it. I don't even ever think of myself as having a style. But I may be the last person to be able to discern it. I'm able to recognize the echoes of writers I admire in my own work, but I can't really look at a book of mine and say, oh yes, I wrote that. They all seem very different, one from the other. And I don't feel as if I've written any of them because, as I said, I don't tend to remember my own books very well.
So thank you, David, for being here with us today, or having come. Possibly we have the very, very last question from Asta. If you want to turn your mic on and do that. Okay. Hi, David. Good evening. I wanted to ask you, after reading the book and talking about it, some of us have read Shelter in Place, and we found it just as good as this one. Are you planning on another book?
I'm always working on something. At the moment, yes, I am, but I'm very superstitious. And so I don't want to say anything about it because I don't want to jinx myself. But yes, I am working on a new book.
Okay, thank you, David. Do you have any questions for us? Just even one? Curiosities about our reading group? I don't know if you'd like to know something.
Well, what are you reading next? What's next on your list?
Okay, the floor's for Nicola. We're reading The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood, who, or which, gained its footing due to the TV series. I had read it already ages ago, and I'm not rereading it, but the group is reading this at the moment.
I was going to recommend to you, although I don't know if it's been translated into Italian or if it will be, but I mentioned to you Andrew Holleran, his new novel, The Kingdom of Sand, is a really, in my opinion, a very, very important book because it's one of the first. It's again autofiction. It's sort of autobiography and it's sort of fiction, but it's the best book I've ever read about. Well, it's a wonderful book about aging, about old age, but about what aging. It's also a book about being a gay man in a environment that could not be more different from New York, in a rural, mostly right-wing, conservative, Trump-loving part of the world. What is it like to be a gay man? And Holleran writes not just about his own experience, but about a lot of the people he's met living where he does. And I would urge it upon you. I hope that it is being published in Italian. I'm guessing it probably will be. It's been very successful here. But to read that back to back with his first novel, Dancer from the Dance, which was from 1977, could be a great, really stimulating experience. And I'll bet you could get him to come on to join you if you can explain the technology to him. He's 80, so he's not, he didn't grow up with Zoom the way the rest of us did. But thank you very much for having me. I'm very grateful, and I wish I were in Milan.
We are actually inviting you to Milan. And so next time you're in Milan, we shall meet or maybe have dinner together. At times when we have dinner together, we present to each other a book. And we will do that for this Christmas as well. Or a literary breakfast, if you want, where we do the literary quiz we've mentioned at the beginning. So whenever you are in Milan, we will throw you a party.
Va bene anche il primo colazione, perché però voglio risotto al salto. Anche a primo colazione, va bene? È il piatto milanese che mi piace di più.
Okay, so we are assuring you a risotto.
Assalto.
We'll have it together with you and Teresa. Thank you again. David, I'm the interpreter. I think there is a question for you in the chat, which you can find.
I answered it.
Okay.
Yes. Ho risposto solo a Teresa. The answer is sure, yes. Would the term paper artist be defined as autofiction? Sure. Except that it's all invented. It's fake autobiography. But I think that qualifies. Okay. See you soon. Thank you. Grazie di nuovo. A presto. Ciao, ciao.
Everyone saying bye. Bye, thank you.